I had the flatbed backed halfway across the ranch yard before Emily Walker stepped out of the equipment shed and parked an old loader directly in front of my trailer ramps. Not beside them, not close enough to make a point, but right in front of them. The bucket sitting low to the ground, the diesel engine rattling rough like it hadn't had time to warm up. I shifted my truck into park and sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking past her at the hay baler resting behind the machine shed, faded red paint, dust packed into the pickup teeth from the last field that it touched. It was mine, or at least it was supposed to be. 3 months earlier, Roy Walker had borrowed it under a signed rental agreement, and 30 days had become 60, 60 had become 90, and every promise to pay had turned into another excuse. I had the contract on the passenger seat, chains in the truck bed, and $50 in diesel already burned just getting there. Emily climbed down from the loader in worn jeans and a faded gray t-shirt stained with grease, her dark hair pulled back tight, and there wasn't a hint of welcome on her face. "You're not taking that baler today," she said. I told her good morning, and she told me she was serious, and I told her so was I, holding up the folder. Her husband had signed for that machine in March, then signed an extension, then another one after promising I'd be paid after the calf auction. Emily didn't look at the papers, like she had already memorized every word of them. "If you take that baler today," she said quietly, "this ranch won't survive the month." I looked past her toward the hayfields rolling out behind the barn, the crop standing tall and green under the morning sun, the kind of crop a rancher dreams about all winter, and I let out a slow breath and told her that wasn't my fault. "No," she said, "no, it isn't." That answer caught me off guard, because most people argued. Most people blamed the weather or the bank or bad luck, but Emily just stood there looking exhausted, like she had been carrying the whole ranch by herself for years. I told her I couldn't keep being the nice guy, that I had equipment payments due, that I needed that baler back, and to each one she just said, quietly, "I know." And the way she said it hurt worse than any excuse Roy had ever given me. Then she reached into her back pocket and unfolded a yellow notepad and told me she had a plan, 30 days. And I almost laughed, because 30 days was exactly what Roy had said 3 months ago. "I'm not Roy," she said, flat, honest, painfully honest. And for the first time, I saw something behind that tough expression that wasn't anger and wasn't pride, but fear, the kind people carry when they're trying to save something they love. She handed me the paper, field schedules, buyer information, auction dates, fuel estimates, expected revenue, every number written in neat, careful handwriting, and at the very top, circled twice in red ink, the words, "First payment to Luke Harper." I asked if she had done all this herself, and she nodded and said she had stayed up most nights after Roy went to sleep. The morning wind moved through the grass. A gate creaked somewhere in the distance, and then she said something that made me stop breathing for a second. "My son doesn't know we're this close to losing everything." I didn't answer. She looked toward the house and told me that if this ranch went under, Noah would lose the only home he had ever known. And her voice cracked just once before she got control of it again, and she said he was 10 years old, that he still thought hard work fixed everything. I felt something heavy settle in my chest, because 10 years earlier I had believed the exact same thing, right before my own father worked himself into an early grave trying to save our family farm in eastern Kansas. He had patched fences with wire he couldn't afford, skipped meals so the cattle could eat, and told me every season that next year would be better, until the season came when there was nothing left to save, and 3 months after the bank took the land, his heart gave out in the same field he had walked every morning of his life. I had sworn after that I would never let a piece of land or machinery break me the way it broke him, and somewhere along the way that promise had turned me into the kind of man who showed up at dawn with a flatbed and a folder of paperwork, because forgiving a debt had killed his father, or so I had always believed. I looked at the contract in my hand,
then at Emily, then past her toward the house, where a screen door creaked open and a boy stepped onto the porch, barefoot, wearing a faded ball cap 2 sizes too big, calling out that breakfast was ready and asking his mother if Mr. Harper was staying to eat. Emily's whole face changed, softening for her son's sake, and she called back that Mr. Harper had a long drive ahead. The boy looked at me, squinting against the sun, and asked if I had used to drive trucks when I was a kid too, and I told him no.
That when I was his age, I drove a tractor on my father's farm, and he asked if my father still had that farm, and for a moment I almost lied to him, the way adults do with children. But something about his open, waiting face stopped me, and I told him no, that the farm was gone a long time ago. Noah was quiet for a second, and then he said, with the simple confidence of a 10-year-old who had never been lied to about anything that mattered, that his daddy always said a walker never lost a fight he was still standing for, and that as long as everybody worked hard, things always turned out all right in the end. I told him that was a good thing to believe, and I meant it, even though some part of me wanted to tell him how complicated the truth usually was, how hard work didn't always save people, how sometimes it just used them up before it let them go. I didn't say any of that. I just told him his mother was lucky to have a helper like him, and he grinned and went back to stacking bales. And I sat there a long moment afterward, listening to the wind move through the grass, thinking about how much I wanted that boy's belief in the world to stay exactly the way it was. On my 3rd visit, I found Roy sitting on the porch steps for the first time since I'd met Emily, moving slow, jaw tight with pain, watching his wife and son work the field he used to work. He nodded at me, and after a while he spoke, and what he said stayed with me longer than almost anything anyone had told me. He said he used to think a man's worth was measured by what he could carry on his own back, and now he couldn't carry anything. And watching his 10-year-old son carry bales that should have been his felt like a kind of dying that didn't show up on any doctor's chart. I told him about my father, about the farm in Kansas, and Roy listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a long while, and then he said, "Maybe pride is just another kind of debt, the kind that compounds faster than any bank loan ever could." 3 weeks into the 30 days, a storm rolled in 2 days before the scheduled hay auction, the kind of storm that could flatten a standing crop and turn weeks of work into mud overnight. I got the call from Emily just after dark, her voice tight, telling me the forecast had moved up, that they maybe had 18 hours to get the rest of the field baled and under cover, and that the baler had thrown a belt an hour earlier, and she didn't have the part. I told her to give me an hour. I drove to my own shop in the dark, pulled the part off a machine of my own, and drove those back roads faster than I had any business driving. When I got there, the sky to the west was already a deep, bruised purple, low and heavy, lit every few seconds by lightning that showed no rain yet, but promised it soon. Roy was standing in the yard on a cane, directing Noah with a flashlight, while Emily worked under the baler by lantern light, her hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. I knelt down beside her and installed the belt myself, and when it was done, I climbed onto the tractor seat without really deciding to, and told her to rest a moment, that I'd run the first rows. We worked through the night, all of us. Roy seated in a folding chair with a lantern at his feet, because standing too long still dropped him to his knees. Noah running fuel and water between us, with his flashlight bouncing across the dark field. Emily and I trading off on the baler every 2 hours as the wind picked up and the first cold drops began to fall. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, soaked through, my hands raw on the wheel, I looked over and saw Roy standing again, leaning hard on the cane, but standing, calling out directions to Noah in a voice that cracked with effort and something that sounded almost like joy. And I realized I hadn't thought about the contract folded up in my truck even once.
We finished the last row just as the real rain began to fall, and we stood there in the yard, all four of us, soaked and exhausted, watching the storm move in over a field that was already baled and covered. And Noah, gritting ear to ear under his soaked-through cap, said this was the best night of his whole life because everybody worked together. None of us told him how close it had really been. 2 days later, the hay sold at auction for more than Emily's careful estimate, enough to cover every overdue payment in full, with enough left to send Roy to a specialist about his back for the first time since the accident. When Emily tried to hand me a check for the full amount, I folded it back into her hand and told her to keep enough for the doctor, that the rest could come on the schedule she had already written, the one with my name circled in red. Because that schedule had never really been about the money, not for either of us. Roy walked out onto the porch that day without his cane for the first few steps, slow and unsteady but upright, and he reached out and shook my hand, the way one man shakes another man's hand when there's something underneath it too big for words. And he said that for 6 weeks he had felt like less than a man in his own home, and that night in the storm was the first time since the accident that he had felt like a father again, even from a folding chair holding a lantern. I drove away from that ranch with an empty trailer and a full heart, and somewhere on that long gravel road, I found myself thinking about my own father again, not with the old grief I usually carried, but with something gentler, almost like gratitude, because for the first time I understood that the lesson he had tried to teach me his whole life wasn't about never needing help, it was about never being too proud or too afraid to offer it. A month later, Roy was back on his feet enough to help Emily plan the next season's planting. The baler stayed right where it belonged, and Noah still didn't know how close his family had come to losing everything. Because some things a parent carries quietly, out of love, so a child can keep believing that hard work and good people are enough to fix almost anything. And on most days, with the right people standing beside you, that turns out to be true. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that pride can be the heaviest debt of all,
and that kindness offered at the right moment can save more than any contract ever could, then take a moment to subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about quiet courage, second chances, and the families who hold on through the storm. Subscribe and join us for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Subscribe now because every story here is a reminder that kindness always finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly this today. This story lies in showing pride as an emotional debt that can be more destructive than financial debt, and in showing real strength often looks like asking for help or quietly offering it. It honors the dignity of struggling families, the unseen labor of caregivers like Emily, the emotional toll on men like Roy who measure worth through physical ability, and the importance of shielding children from adult fears while still letting them feel useful and trusted. It also reflects on legacy and forgiveness, offering older viewers a gentle reminder that compassion shown at the right moment can change the course of someone's life.